Sunset party, ho!
Sunset, sir.
Pipe the still. Pipe the carry on.
At the time of the Falklands conflict, I was captain of HMS Endurance. And every year since then, we've held a reunion party on board the ship.
Nice to see you.
Hello, sir.
War forms unique bonds. Most of that great ship's company from 1982 are here tonight. 120 volunteers, including a detachment of Royal Marines.
Hello. Hail, hail.
10 years ago, I watched the Falklands crisis develop from the bridge of this ship. I saw signs and signals of war, but my warnings were ignored and 1,000 lives were lost. These deaths were avoidable, and I said so at the time. But when I came home, I was ordered to suppress my views.
The whole run-up to the Falklands conflict is very much a matter for the Franks inquiry, and I don't think you would wish me to answer any question on that subject, which is obviously sub judice.
The newspapers made quite a meal of it in 1982, but even after the Franks inquiry into the conflict, I was not allowed to tell my story. I left the Navy in '88. Now, for the first time, I can speak freely. For this film, I've returned to the peaceful islands I knew so well, the Falklands. I wanted to talk to my friends here about what really happened. As captain of the Endurance, I felt a responsibility for the Falklands, an outpost of empire where time seemed to have stood still, where the people still called Britain home. The islanders were close to my heart. Like them, I believed in those old-fashioned values of honour, duty, and loyalty to Queen and country. This annual remembrance service is dedicated now to the dead of all the wars that Britain has fought, including the Falklands campaign. I took command of HMS Endurance in 1980. She had a multiple role, as survey ship, ice patrol vessel and Falklands guard ship, the military eyes and ears of the government. Nicknamed the Red Plum, Endurance was a symbol of British presence in the South Atlantic, and the one and only reassurance to the islanders that Britain, 8,000 miles away, still cared.
Vessel came through into the harbour, it was a sign of Great Britain coming to the Falklands. All winter long, you'd be here without any ships at all. And the moment Endurance reappeared, you had that feeling, we're still part of Great Britain. Here's our ship coming back through the Narrows again, coming through flying the flag. Great presence, great to see her in the harbour.
But in June 1981, that reassurance vanished when the Defence Secretary, John Nott, announced sweeping cuts in the Navy, including my own ship Endurance. He described her as foundering and falling to pieces. That decision started a chain of events that was to change all our lives. My old colleague Brian Earthwaite was working in the Ministry of Defence at the time and saw the political battle developing.
Nott was unwilling, shall we put it that way, because it would affect his judgment as far as where the cut should be, to take into account the strategic arguments. I think that's really where we are. He wouldn't listen to them because it would deflect him from his purpose. Somewhere had to be cut. He had decided the Navy and he wasn't going to shift his mind.
And if he was deflected, he'd take it out somewhere else?
Well, I think yes. I mean, it had to come from somewhere, in his view. And the Navy was a soft option. And we put up things eventually, as I've said before, we put up things to try and bring it home to him, like cutting HMS Endurance and the Royal Yacht Britannia. He funked Britannia, but he persisted with Endurance.
To me, the decision was contemptible. I made my views known in Whitehall while Lord Shackleton started a campaign. We were just months away from war. It was a false economy. It only cost £3 million to run this ship. It was a very good reason for keeping it going. It was a ship with 4 very good roles, first of which was the guardship role. And the guardship role was the particularly important role in this instance, because by withdrawing it, it gave a very clear signal to Argentina that the British couldn't give a stuff about these islands. Under the threat of John Nott's axe, Endurance left her home base in October '81 for what we thought would be the last of our annual deployments south. The passage would be broken by stops in South American naval bases where we were usually warmly welcomed. This year, things were different. November the 30th, Buenos Aires. I swapped ship's itineraries with my Argentine opposite number, Captain Trombetta. He told me he was going to Antarctica, but 3 weeks later he turned up illegally on the British island of South Georgia. He lied to me. Why? I reported this to London. January the 25th, 1982, Argentine's closest base to the Falkland Islands, Ushuaia. I was snubbed by the Argentine base commander. His deputy said they had been ordered not to fraternize with the British. I was warned that we were entering a war zone. War against whom, I asked. The British in the Malvinas, he answered. Again, I reported to London. January the 30th, Punta Arenas in Chile. My Chilean naval friends told me about the Argentines' intention to invade the Falklands. Once again, I reported all this to London, but there was no response.
The problem really was that anything that came from Endurance was thought to be part of the Navy's playing politics to try and save Endurance. As you well know, there'd been a tremendous groundswell of support, both in the House of Commons and in the country. So it appeared that we were organising a sort of mass Save Endurance campaign.
In the South Atlantic, my local boss was Rex Hunt, the governor of the Falkland Islands. He shared my anxieties, but like me, his own credibility rating back in Whitehall was low. It seemed that my alarm signal stayed in the bottom of some civil servant's in-tray.
At ministerial level, we certainly were not being briefed, or certainly I was not being briefed, and I don't think the Foreign Office ministers were either, because I dealt with Richard Luce, who in those days was Minister of State with responsibility for South American affairs. And neither of us, to my clear memory, thought that there would be an invasion until literally a few days before.
Why do you think this was? Was the intelligence just not getting through from Buenos Aires and possibly from here?
Well, one can only conclude that however these matters are dealt with, that they were not dealt with properly. I mean, whatever the subsequent inquiry may have said, the fact of the matter was the information wasn't clear, and ministers can only react to the information they're given by a fairly substantial and, one hopes, well-organised machine.
My fears were not shared by our ambassador in Buenos Aires, Anthony Williams. He took the line that the Argentines were merely saber-rattling. His placatory attitude is revealed by an extraordinary story. Just one day before the invasion, former Conservative MP Sir Frederick Bennett was on his way to Chile. He was due to fly on to Buenos Aires the next day.
on this very long flight, when we got over Santiago, there was the usual danger of very thick fog, and we circled and circled and circled, were unable to land until we virtually ran out of fuel, and there was no place to go except an Argentinian military airport up in the mountains, and we were then told that the Argentinians had allowed us as an emergency to refuel, but that nobody was to be allowed to leave the aircraft, and we were to keep our curtains closed within the aeroplane. The latter order I disobeyed because I was interested why it was issued, and out of that window, which they hadn't noticed was one that wasn't, I saw definite preparations that I remember from the last war for a military operation taking place, and there was sort of an attempt made by the captain of the aircraft, I think, to say, well, it could have been a military exercise, but I've seen enough of that. This was no military exercise. There were armed men and ammunition being loaded onto planes and Bren carriers, and the whole operation looked like D-Day -1 sort of thing, as what was taking place.
On arrival in Chile, General Pinochet summoned Sir Frederick to see him.
And he greeted me in a very friendly way, and then said, I think, Sir Frederick, you ought to know that Argentina is going to be at war by tomorrow morning.
Alarmed, he called our ambassador in Buenos Aires.
I had said, I don't think it's going to be very appropriate for me to come and give my address at luncheon tomorrow, in view of what I've heard. And he disputed this and said that I was being fanciful. In fact, I think he used the word almost hysterical, and that there was a possible danger of what I had just told him.
But for me, the crisis had already begun. 2 weeks before the invasion, at Leith in South Georgia, a party of Argentine scrap metal merchants, led by Konstantin Davidov, had been landed by their navy. The pretext was to carry out clearance work on the old whaling station. In my view, it was a cover-up for a military operation.
Not too good on gates.
At that time, we were in Stanley. We'd been invited to dinner by our friends, the Stuarts. 10 years on, I've come back for another dinner with Ian and Hulda.
Hello, Ian Stewart. This is my wife, Helen.
Hello, Nick. Hello.
Lovely to see you again.
Hello. Very smart. But got the right colours.
Endurance colours.
Endurance colours.
We weren't thinking of blue and white or anything, were you?
Sunderland Football Club.
Do come through, anyway.
But what began as a dinner party that night of March the 20th, 1982, quickly turned into a council of war when we heard about the Argentine landing.
Not, actually.
Well, I think everybody's meal was delayed by about 2 hours, wasn't it, as you all sort of gathered round the table here.
I was trying to remember earlier how many, I mean, obviously Rex and Mavis and yourselves, but who else was here? Connie and Dick, yes.
I think.
Nick,
yes.
That's right.
Yes, because
Robin,
remember
Jean,
Robert
Peter,
came in and said to me, I think he said, this is history in the making, and I have a nasty feeling it's history we could do without.
Yes.
Didn't realise how prophetic my words were going to be.
But before that, the officer of the day, as I recall, had come in drenched, his oilskins, well, I mean his fur weather jacket, and he'd either been virtually submerged in the boat coming in with the usual gale of wind, and came in with a rather soggy bit of paper which said, "Sail forthwith." And sail we did. The Argentines had raised their flag on South Georgia and had fired shots. We even overheard the Argentine Defense Ministry on the radio congratulating their men on an operation well done.
Well, I think, absolutely 100% in agreement with you that we must send the Endurance back down there to evict the scrap metal merchants until they had observed the proper laws of the Falklands dependencies. It was absurd to suggest that they didn't know what they should have been doing. Davidoff knew perfectly well that he should have landed. at Grytviken first, and so did the captain. As a naval captain yourself, you would know that the Argentine captain must have been aware of the normal formalities of going into South Georgia, and so I was all for sending the Endurance down.
Suddenly at South Georgia, our orders were changed. Endurance was simply to keep watch on the Argentines. What I didn't know was that London had intercepted an Argentine message ordering their fleet to prevent my ship from removing the so-called scrap dealers. Whitehall didn't want to be seen to escalate the tension. Well, at the time, we felt that we were being prevented from doing what we were sent to do. But that's not the first time that the British military has turned up prepared to go into action, to be called off at the 11th hour.
But if your men, there was a real and very, very grave danger that the Endurance would have been sunk, how would you feel about that? Would you have been prepared to have taken that risk?
Oh, of course. And I was going to take any number of risks at that stage to either take on the opposition with whatever arms I had, which was pretty limited. I could use her to ram, for instance, a tanker, and their ships, because they couldn't exist without fueling every 2 or 3 days, had to have a tanker with them. And I would have rammed the tanker, and I would have put AS-12 missiles, which were the ones that we carried, through their other ships.
And you would have risked the whole ship's company to do that?
I would have to have fought my way out of it. But I was being backseat driven by Whitehall, and they didn't want to fight. Instead, I was ordered to land my Royal Marines and head back to Stanley, 4 days away. Helplessly, we listened to the awful news of the invasion. The whole thing was a monumental cock-up. We were stuck out there in mid-ocean, too far away to defend Stanley, and with our Marines now stranded without support on South Georgia, at Grytviken. Grytviken, this is Endurance. I assume that you can hear me. Rules of engagement are as stated earlier this morning. Defend if you are provoked. Over.
Suddenly, it all began to happen. There was a puma that appeared from nowhere. And I looked at this thing and I thought, if this thing lands, it's Endex for us. There's going to 20 troops are going to get out of that, and they're going to be so close, they're going to be on us in no time. I remember giving the order, hit it, and with that, every man in the detachment opened fire on this helicopter, and it was absolutely riddled with bullets. Well, the helicopter managed to make it across the bay with smoke pouring out the back and crashed on the far side. And basically, I don't think we saw anybody get out of that helicopter, did we? And what happened was that the Gorico, the corvette, which was now heading back out to sea, had obviously just seen this happen over her shoulder and thought, my God, I'd better get back in there and help the boys. And when the ship got to that point of no return where she was committed, I remember giving the order to open fire, and the detachment let rip with the 66mm anti-tank rockets and the 84mm Carl Gustav anti-tank rockets. And the first round from the Carl Gustav landed, 20 or 30 meters short of the ship. I mean, we were really firing out of the range of these weapons, so it was really a bit of fire and hope. And I'm not sure whether the round actually ricocheted off the water and hit the ship, or actually went into the water and hit the ship below the waterline, but suffice to say, there was a massive explosion in the ship's side. So within the space of 20 seconds perhaps, this ship had ceased firing completely, and she was plodding through the water doing 2 knots with no fire heading our way, and we were just, it was like a turkey shoot for us. You just unload the magazines as quickly as you could into this ship.
Keith Mill's gallant men had trapped a squad of Argentine Marines at the end of the bay, but eventually they themselves were surrounded and forced to surrender.
I remember rising out of that trench was one of my most worried moments in my whole life, where I thought, you know, this could easily be it. And I tentatively walked along the beach a matter of 150 meters to where I thought these Argentines were, and I was met by an Argentine officer who came out of the buildings. And fortunately for me, he spoke very good English, because I didn't speak a word of Spanish and we would have had problems communicating. And I said, look, I think you're in a very difficult position here. I said, we've got you trapped here, and at the end of the day, if this battle continues, then you're all going to die. Now, we'll probably all die as well, but that doesn't really matter to us because we don't have an option. I said, but you do. If you're prepared to accept our ceasefire, our surrender, guarantee good treatment for my men, then we'll actually knock it on the head here and now. Well, this guy was so shocked, he grabbed my hand and shook it vigorously. And he thought we were all kamikaze soldiers and that we were there to the very last. And I think the relief that was displayed by the Argentines was incredible.
At last, after days of cat-and-mouse games, Endurance was joined by ships from the task force with orders to retake South Georgia. Attempting to land special forces, we came under threat from the Argentines. We were in grave danger of being sunk. I tried to contact my superior in London, Admiral Halifax. I was told that the person I wanted to speak to was having lunch, and that would I ring back again when he'd completed his lunch. Yep. So I did, and he rang me back, and he said, "Are you having a problem, Nick?" And I said, "Yes, I am a bit." And I said, if you can hear a conversation in Spanish going on, it's an aeroplane, an Argentine aeroplane going over the top, talking to a submarine. He said, "Oh, I don't think it's as close as you think it is." And I said, "Well, I don't know how you should know. We're way back down in your bunker at that end, but I can assure you it sounds pretty close to me here." But we weren't sunk that afternoon, and in fact our flight commander, Tony Ellerbeck, landed the special forces with great courage and skill. The next morning, the Argentine submarine, the Santa Fe, was stupid enough to be caught on the surface. Our helicopters opened fire and drove her back into Grytviken. A third of their submarine force had been destroyed. A couple of days later, the captain, now a prisoner, was asked why he didn't shoot at us when he had us in his periscope. And he said, "I don't know. I think it was that excellent cocktail party you gave us in Mar del Plata 3 weeks ago." So the moral of the story really is don't knock cocktail parties because your life might well be spared. We took the surrender of South Georgia from the Argentine commander Astes on the 26th of April. But who was it who announced the fact to the nation? The very man who'd tried to cut Endurance, John Knott.
Be pleased to inform Her Majesty that the White Ensign flies alongside the Union Jack in South Georgia. God save the Queen.
What happens next, Mr. Knott?
Thank you very much.
Just
rejoice at that news and congratulate our forces and the Marines.
Are we going
Good
to
night,
declare war on
gentlemen.
Argentina, Mrs. Thatcher?
Rejoice.
Load correct. Fire!
Not everyone rejoiced. Retaking South Georgia was the first counter-offensive of an unnecessary and bloody war. A war that would claim the lives of 1,000 men and maim countless more. It was one of the rare occasions in history that ordinary British people had been invaded. Stuck out at South Georgia, I had little idea of what was happening to my friends 400 miles away on the Falklands. Brooke Hardcastle found himself locked up in the Goose Green Community Hall with 114 other islanders.
We came to be rounded up by the Argentines because the RAF had bombed our airstrip, and they thought we'd been sending messages to the British, and perhaps to the Endurance in particular, and of course we hadn't, but they rounded us all up, just as we were, on a Sunday morning. And some people arrived without their false teeth and in carpet slippers, and, you know, the day went on and nothing happened, and we began to get a bit agitated. Every time we opened the door, a fellow would cock his rifle and say in Spanish, "Close the door." And, well, nobody came, and it became dark, and we had 34 children in here under the age of 15, 2 elderly ladies over 80, and, you know, where did we sleep? What did we do? What do we eat?
Clearly the Argentines had made no provision for coping with civilians under fire.
Eventually we got an Argentine Air Force officer, in fact, who came in, and he allowed me to go to the store. And you can imagine going into a store and, you know, what am I going to get for 115 people? Well, in fact, I got a case of cream crackers and a case of baked beans, which, not the best of fare, but it kept us going in the first couple of days. It was quite difficult at times, very difficult.
It was no easier back in Stanley, which was under Argentine occupation for 74 days.
Hello, Jane.
Jane McEachin, who now runs a taxi service, had been widowed just before the invasion, leaving her alone with 2 small children. She was apprehensive about how the islanders would be treated by the Argentines. But what really shocked her was the way in which they treated their own.
There was a lot of the young conscripts that lived down on the seafront. And the kids used to go out and take them out coffee and talk to one of these young lads. And he got really, really bad trench foot. He had blistered feet, and he was walking around crying this day, literally dragging his gun down along the wall. And one of his seniors came down and gave him a right rollicking, and he didn't take much heed of him. He just carried on crying, dragging his gun, and he shot him, cold-blood murder, shot him and kicked him over the sea wall.
Terrible.
And that's when I realised if they'll do that to their own, it's time to get these kids out of here, you know, try and get them somewhere where it seems a little bit safe to them anyway.
The former police chief, Terry Peck, was warned that he was about to be arrested by the Argentines for spying. He decided to take to the hills.
Often the Argentines used to fly their choppers in, searching the beaches and that. One occasion I spent a good 3/4 of an hour upside down in a ditch, you know, waiting for them to move on. Then I moved on to Green Patch, and previous to the invasion taking place, you will remember well HMS Endurance had a party ashore doing survey work, and they'd left rations and a lot of clothing and footwear there. So I was lucky. The next morning, just after daybreak, I got ready to move on. But before I could do that, the Argentine choppers flew in again and surrounded the place, rounded up everybody in the farm, including women and children. And my Bergen I'd left in the cookhouse. Unknown to me, one of the children of the Gilding family had opened it and pulled my camouflage smock out of it. So the first thing I seen was this Argentine officer and coming up the green carrying this smock, and I thought, oh my God, here we go. But he came in and he was lambing off in Spanish. I learned afterwards that he'd given Mrs. Gilding, Jackie Gilding, quite a hard time of it. And she convinced him that this had been left behind by some of your ship's company at the time, so that seemed to satisfy him, which was fortunate.
Eventually, Terry Peck moved west to meet up with the British forces that had landed at Port San Carlos. He then joined 3 Para as a guide in their march back towards Stanley and took part in the bloodiest battle of the war on Mount Longdon.
Going in under fire was the most terrifying thing you could do. You hit the deck, you get up and you go forward, but getting up again for the second, third time isn't easy at all. But as I said, you know, going with these lads, they were the real professionals. But, you know, it did seem to go on, and it did go on for hour after hour, you know, and being pinned down by artillery and sniper fire, because that was quite horrendous. This chap, Argentine sniper, he kept up continuously through the night, and he caused quite a lot of casualties to ourselves. And I think it was something like 10 hours later before we actually secured Mount Longdon. But actually to experience that assault on the mountain was something which will remain with me forever. To see the lads being wounded and mutilated was quite horrendous.
How does it feel, Terry, to be back up on top here again, to some extent, reliving.
I always get upset later on, you know.
Yes.
And I usually end up soaking it away, which is daft, I know, but the memories do come hurtling back and push them away, but they're still...
I'm sure they do. Yes.
So that's why I've always promised to make an annual pilgrimage here, you
Yeah.
know, and I do that every year for us.
The bitter irony is that none of this need have happened. It seemed to me that once again the armed forces had saved the politicians' necks. But a serving officer isn't supposed to say such things. Ours is not to reason why. I now faced another kind of battle. Without my knowledge, some comments which I had made on board ship found their way onto television news.
We all know by the cold shoulder we got in Ushuaia, by the notices in various newspapers, by the Davidoff front, all the signs were there. And then the build-up of the fleet over the 2 weeks before it actually happened, all that was reported. Now, we could see it was going to happen. Why couldn't anybody else?
Indeed, the press seemed to be everywhere.
I remember what is now referred to as the Green Lights interview. I was accosted outside the Upland Goose by Jeremy Harris of the BBC, who wanted my views on how the whole thing happened and why it happened. And I said, oh, no, there's a major clampdown on anything that I come out with as far as you guys are concerned. And we went back on board the ship with Rex Hunt. And I said, Rex, I better not speak to this guy. And he said, well, don't see why not. And so I said, all right, I will.
During the interview, I said that the government had given the Argentines a series of green lights to invade the Falklands.
We'd left here and we were on our way to Ascension. And one of my sailors had a very sick mother, and he asked if he could telephone home, which was strictly illegal. And so I said yes, of course. And he rang his home, where his mother was suffering from terminal cancer. And she died later. And he came into my cabin and thanked me profusely. But as he was thanking me, he said, I have to tell you, sir, that my mum says you're in the shit again. And I said, very sorry to hear this. How did this happen? Oh, because we were at sea and had been at sea for umpteen weeks. And he said, well, you're all over the front page of the Observer.
Before we arrived back at Chatham, 2 men from the Ministry of Defence boarded Endurance. They briefed me with a set of answers to all the questions the press were bound to ask. As expected, we were besieged by the press and television cameras.
The whole run-up to the Falklands conflict is very much a matter for the Franks inquiry, and I don't think you would wish me to answer any question on that subject, which is obviously sub judice. I think most of the ships, certainly the longer-term ships, were met by Mrs. Thatcher and the Commander-in-Chief and so on. We weren't met by either of them. We were met by the second in command at Northwood
and a peer called Lord Trenchard, who at the time I think was a minister. And I had to produce the whole ship's company in the hangar, and Lord Trenchard stood up in front of everybody and he said, very good job, first class job, very good job indeed, very good job, good job. And I could see the sailors nudging each other, saying, what is this man on about? And fortunately the day was saved by Lord Shackleton, who'd come out in a completely unofficial capacity and had followed our movements from start to finish, who stood in front of the whole ship's company and said exactly what any politician would have said, I think, for a ship returning home from a year abroad, having had in some cases a somewhat trying time. I'd put my head on the chopping block, and although I was interviewed by the Franks inquiry into the conflict, much of my evidence was ignored. To me, it was a whitewash, another Whitehall farce.
I think we have a very interesting way of covering these things up, and the Franks inquiry did its best, but it was couched in very, I'm going to say diplomatic, that's not the word, bureaucratic terms. And the hard truth is that in a system as complicated and as well established as ours, getting things right doesn't always pay, and getting things wrong doesn't always get punished.
Though I had 2 more seagoing commands, my career was effectively over. Endurance was finally decommissioned in 1991. Mr. Knott's so-called foundering wreck, Endurance, had destroyed a submarine, damaged a frigate, shot down 2 helicopters, and played a significant part in recapturing 2 islands, South Georgia and Southern Thule. Like the Falklands themselves, Endurance represents an age gone by, an age of imperial power, and as British responsibilities have shrunk, so has the Royal Navy. It's the end of an era, inevitable, I suppose, but one which I personally regret. My story is about conflict between politicians and the armed forces as much as about war. It remains a very British affair, reflecting Whitehall characteristics of arrogance, obsession with secrecy, and a refusal to admit mistakes. This may be the end for Endurance, but I hope it's not the end for what she represented. A commitment to defending people and their rights, a commitment to government responsibility.